Two parts. One is where I'm sort of speaking as, I don't know, an observer with some expert background in particular things, but also I'm going to be talking about general impressions of what we collectively have learned from the crisis as it has developed. And I don't know about you, but over the last year, I have learned a huge amount about church generally, community, what it actually means. And I don't have any kind of great conclusions, but I just like to throw this out. So first of all, what will the impact be on religion in general in the United States? And I have to tell you, I have a fairly pessimistic view on this. Let me explain. There's an image that I have used a lot when speaking about these sort of things in the last year, which is that of the rocket sled. If you remember those things that reach amazing speeds in it's a very short time. What I think has happened is you've had trends developing in lots of things over the last 20 years, say. And what the pandemic has done is condense the time that those changes affect from years or decades into months. So you get like the rocket sled effect. And I'll give you an example, which is many of us know that stores and department stores and malls were in deep trouble in the 20-teens. But the last year was like somebody hit them very hard with a hammer. And we only have to look at our own Nittany Mall to see what happens there. Some of the changes within the churches and religion broadly defined have been very obvious for 10 or 15 years right now. And what I'm concerned by is the fact that the pandemic has that kind of rocket sled impact. And I would cite a couple. The United States has always been something of a mystery for scholars of religion for this reason. It is a very wealthy society. It is a society with a very high fertility rate, which does correspond to a participation in religion. And it's a very religious society. How can you have a rich, advanced society which is also very religious? So if you look at Europe, for example, that's absolutely baffling. Why is the United States so different? And what's happened over the last 10 years or so is the United States has become a lot less different. Its fertility rates, its family size has declined very steeply. The US demographically now looks a lot like Denmark. And along with that fertility rate, you also get a much more secularized society. And there are any number of suggestive points about this. For example, church affiliation, number of people who actually belong to churches. And one figure that I find very useful is that of the nuns, N-O-N-E, not N-U-N. You ask people in a survey, what is your religious affiliation? And they say none. That does not mean they're atheists. That doesn't mean they're rejecting God or the supernatural, but it does mean I have nothing to do with a religious affiliation. That figure used to be tiny, far, far lower in the US than in Europe. It is now growing very fast. And today, the three largest religious groups in the United States are evangelicals, Catholics, and nuns, with one exception. There are now considerably more nuns than Catholics. And I am virtually certain that within the next 2 years or so, when the next census figure, the next survey is taken, the nuns are going to be considerably the largest. They're going to be up to 25 or 30%. I say again, this does not mean, this is not atheists, this is not agnostics, but this is people who reject religious affiliation. If you look at nuns, they're often very surprising. America has the most religious nuns in the world. These are people who will often say, you know, yes, I attend church. Yes, I pray. Yes, I read the Bible, but I will not accept a religious affiliation. I will not be called evangelical or Catholic or whatever. I think that is a leading step towards secularization, which is what has been coming for a decade or so. And I think that the pandemic has accelerated and will accelerate this. And when people look back at the process of religious change in the United States, they will focus on 2020 as a key turning point, and they'll all say, aha, the pandemic had this big effect. And I would say, well, yeah, maybe, but it just accelerated trends that were happening anyway. And interestingly, the big change in this was, first of all, the 2008 economic crisis. And that meant it was much harder for people to start families, buy houses, do the sort of thing from which they would then go out and become church members or members of a religious group. And 2020 has accelerated that. So my sort of long-term perspective is 2020 will mark a real change. It will mark a significant turning point. Lots of different aspects of that, as well as that broad change. One is money. One is finances. A lot of people had very, very difficult last year, even with the amount of government aid that was going. Many religious institutions in the US were in a lot of trouble anyway. A lot of Catholic churches, Catholic dioceses were in deep trouble because of litigation. Many Pentecostal churches were in deep trouble as an after effect of 2008. And urban churches especially were in deep trouble anyway before 2020. 2020, the rocket sled came by and accelerated those changes and made things dramatically more critical. The other rocket sled effect is seminaries. Seminaries were already in a great deal of trouble over the last 20 years. There were closures, there were consolidations, and if you follow what is happening in the seminaries, that crisis has become much more critical. And it really has caused a major rethink in the whole concept of seminary education, what you expect people to do once you move to remote learning. What are the implications of that? And so there are a lot of issues there. I would also say that the pandemic crisis has made us think very seriously indeed about what religion, what religious practice actually is, and what it involves, and how far it involves some kind of physical participation of going to a particular place. And a lesson I get from this is it is very, very hard to be a practicing religious believer on your own or in a family physically, even if you do have those remote and Zoom connections. Churches last year obviously had to cut themselves off. They had to take people out of the churches, absolutely essential. I don't criticize any decisions that any institution made last year because they were dealing with a situation where there were no roadmaps, there were no precedents, they were making up the rules as they went, and they were being very cautious. But I think through what this means, for instance, for concepts of clergy, all sorts of clergy, and it just makes you think how much of what clergy does depends on personal interactions, and a personal interaction is still a face-to-face interaction, and you have clergy who are prevented from doing such basic familiar concepts as, well, baptisms, marriages, and funerals. They can do things, but they cannot do them in anything like the same way. I don't know if you saw this. I am anything but a fan of British royalty, but I don't know how many of you saw the photos of the funeral of Prince Philip, where it is such a limited, small event, and even the Queen has to sit on her own. And that kind of personal detachment and separation is a shock to all our concepts of what religious practice involves. It involves that kind of collective activity. It involves that kind of solidarity. And so what it involves is concepts of community, and let me use the word family. If you are a member of a church, that is a family of sorts. And if you cannot actually hang out with family, associate with family, and visit family, then that is a very, very traumatic, traumatic shock. And that works across religions. So you see Jews, for example, trying to have seders remotely. And next time I will talk about some of these aspects of remote. But the basic rule is it is not the same. You know, if I look at St. Andrews, I generally do not see anything that Father Jeff could have done over the last year that he did not do. As we move to those remote services, you realize how much is done can be done in an imaginative and creative way. But at the same time, you realize the limitations of that in any circumstances. I just draw an analogy. I believe the Penn State Music School, or the one of the big displays, is organizing something by the Kronos Quartet, one of this absolutely wonderful classical music enterprise. I have many of albums of theirs. I love them. But what is the difference between seeing the Kronos Quartet on screen as if it's any television program and being physically in the same hall with these individuals? In terms of listening to the music, that's one thing. But being physically present does mean something very, very different. And so the key question here is, first of all, what this has done is maybe it makes us appreciate what we've had for years, and will have again at some point. But I wonder how much we will be able to reconstruct after the pandemic. Yes, there will be an after the pandemic. We will be able to meet again, but will we be meeting in a smaller, reduced, more compact group with declining numbers and older congregations? Like I say, that is partly a consequence of the pandemic as such, but it's also longer term trends that have been so rapidly accelerated. And if you think through this, I mean, okay, I'm a historian. I think in terms of analogies from decades and centuries past. One of the great analogies I think of is the Great Depression. And we don't really pay enough attention to this in terms of what that did for churches. Urban churches did fine. But the Great Depression of the 30s wiped out a large proportion of America's rural churches. It was absolutely devastating. Because people were moving away, you didn't have the population bases anymore, but above all, you did not have the financial support. And when you drive around Pennsylvania villages around Center County, you'll see a lot of these old churches, which were clearly flourishing in the late 19th century. You find pretty much they vanished in the 30s, and money played a very large part of it. So you think of demographics and of money. Now, let me stress here, I'm presenting a view, and there are other people who would say other things. For example, I've seen the opinion expressed that once the pandemic ends, we will be set for some kind of basically religious revival, that people will be so anxious to get back into churches, to get back into religious services. There will be this kind of great sigh of relief, and it'll be back to normal. And I don't think so. I think what has happened already, even before the pandemic, is we had this direction of all religion, not just Christianity, towards older cores, with major defections from religion of younger people, younger adults. I come back to the economic side. If we were in a situation where people were still able to form families, buy houses, and set up these family units and go to organized religion, wonderful. Religion would do fine. But that was already a fading vision before that, because of general long-term economic trends that are just not going to be reversed. I can give you any number of other trends that have been working at the same time. I think political trends have had an impact, and I honestly do not want to turn this into a sort of a particularly political discussion. But when, for example, so much controversy focuses around evangelicals in politics, of religious involvement in politics, and the media are constantly listing evangelical in the same sentence as crisis, then it is inevitable that more people are going to turn away from that kind of religious affiliation, not away from religion as such, but a kind of church membership, church affiliation. If I was projecting, and I obviously don't want to do numbers here, the Episcopal Church, for example, has been in a fairly steady decline now for about 40 to 50 years. It reached peak at about 3.5 million in the mid-late 60s. 20 years ago, the normal working figure that I was giving was about 2 million, give or take. There was a move away to more conservative Anglican groups, but they're not big numerically. Maybe they account for about 100,000. The Episcopal Church, I don't know what the last figure was, but if it's as many as 1.8 or 1.7 million these days, I would be surprised. I would say in 10 years it could be down to about 1.5 million and declining, and more troublingly, aging fast. Kind of a depressing note, and of course the problem is, for many churches, they are then bound to quite substantial premises and buildings that they have to maintain. That gets to the money issue, and that gets to broad organizational issues of, if you have dioceses with a lot fewer parishes, do you end up consolidating parishes? You know, back when the Episcopal Church in Pennsylvania was formed back in the late 18th century, there was a diocese of Pennsylvania, and it does make you wonder whether we will live to see a far smaller number of dioceses. we might have different opinions on this, but for me, the biggest single lesson or takeaway from this whole experience has been that issue of community and contact. And as you might have noticed, we are all gathered right now round screens. What is the difference between that and us sitting in Canterbury Hall? You know, we are all speaking, we're all able to communicate. But when you take that physical presence out, that sense of being in a place, of participating, is it possible to have the same sense of any kind of experience, any kind of religious experience? And my fear is that screens are screens. If you are watching a television program or watching a church service, doesn't it ultimately merge into the same same experience? I'm sitting in the same chair. I'm watching the same screens. Do I start getting confused and I start think that I'm watching a new television series called Desperate Episcopalians of Centre County? And that is maybe the most important question that we have to come to terms with. And again, it's like this rocket sled effect. These were questions that we were going to have to answer anyway in the 2020s and the 2030s. We got hit over the head and we had to figure them out in 2020. I have seen so many imaginative efforts at using media, at using Zoom, but it isn't the same. I just give you one very small example. I was very interested. You know, I have of course been watching our communion services, and we are Episcopalians, so communion, sacraments mean a lot to us. I have been very interested that I was relating much more strongly to morning prayer. Why? Because morning prayer involves so much more by way of text to consider. It appeals to that part of the brain and maybe that part of the spiritual psyche. Whereas with communion, maybe as the famous joke says, well, you had to be there. And here's my core theme here. What this has taught us is about being there. What does it mean to be in a place to participate in religion? In 5 years, what will we be doing? Will we be watching services on Zoom or whatever the successor is at that point? Will we be valuing church as an opportunity to get a kind of physical, personal interaction that we do not get in any other enterprise? There is an opportunity for us in church to provide service, to provide that sense of participation, presence, place that you don't get if you're attending university lectures anymore. You know, students are not going to be coming back to lectures in anything like the same way. What can church offer that people cannot get in the rest of the world? And here's my theme. What church should be doing is offering what we've always thought of as the real world. And what I'm going to be talking about next time is thinking more about this of, I think of it in terms of P's, that is place, presence, participation, physicality, proximity. I'm up for more P's if anyone has any. But bottom line, what does it mean to be clergy in a world where this kind of physical interaction is not possible? And what does it mean to be a church that is focused above all on sacraments and on that kind of physical presence in this world. 20 years ago, I remember writing something about churches in Brazil that were regarded as being wildly superstitious. And what they were doing was they were broadcasting their services over TV. And they were inviting people to put a glass of water in front of the TV, and then the televangelist would bless it. And I'm saying, oh, my Lord, this is terrible. This is superstition. This is outrageous. And maybe it is. But how far can you convey religious experience in a sacramental church electronically? And if you can't do it, will people come back? And if you've noticed that I am going off on all sorts of random tangents, you're exactly right. But this experience over the last year has just set up so many different thoughts for me about absolutely basic issues of how we interact and how we interact in matters of religion. Like I said, was that the most organized presentation ever? No, but if it cast out some general ideas, that would be helpful. And I will throw that open to any kind of questions or objections.